3 days. That's all it took to destroy a career that had taken nearly 20 years to build. And the funny thing is, none of it would have happened if one man had simply looked at a piece of paper before letting his ego do the talking. When people hear this story, they usually think I got revenge. But that's not how I see it. I think of it as accountability finally catching up to someone who had spent far too long believing rules only applied to everyone else. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 36 years old, a disabled Army veteran living in a quiet subdivision outside Columbus, Ohio called Maple Ridge Crossing. It's the kind of neighborhood where everyone waves while mowing the lawn, where kids ride bicycles until the streetlights come on, where retirees obsess over flowers and perfectly trimmed hedges. After 2 deployments overseas, that kind of ordinary life felt like winning the lottery. I wasn't looking for excitement anymore. I wanted routine, peace, the sound of birds in the morning instead of helicopters. Most people in the neighborhood knew me as the quiet guy with the black Labrador named Ranger. What they didn't know was that Ranger wasn't just a dog. He was the reason I could sleep through the night without waking up convinced I was back overseas. He knew when my anxiety started climbing before I did. He'd nudge my hand, lean against my leg, or wake me from nightmares before they spiraled into panic. The Department of Veterans Affairs had approved him as my service animal years earlier, and every piece of paperwork imaginable sat neatly inside a folder in my home office. Honestly, I never expected to need any of it. Service dogs are protected under federal law. At least, that's what I believed. Everything changed on the Tuesday afternoon when I opened my mailbox. Mixed between grocery coupons and an electric bill was a certified envelope with the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association logo stamped across the front. I almost laughed because HOA letters usually meant someone painted a fence the wrong shade of beige or forgot to hide their trash cans. Then I opened it. According to the letter, I had committed an unauthorized pet violation. They demanded $800 in fines and ordered me to permanently remove Ranger from the property within 7 days. If I failed to comply, they would begin placing liens against my home and pursue additional legal action. I read it 3 times because my brain refused to accept that it was real. Ranger was lying at my feet while I stood there in the driveway holding that letter, completely confused. My neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, happened to be watering her roses and asked if everything was okay. I forced a smile and said it was probably some clerical mistake. Deep down, I actually believed that. Mistakes happen. People click the wrong box. Someone forgets to update a file. I wasn't angry yet. I was optimistic. That optimism lasted until Thursday morning when I walked into the HOA office carrying a folder filled with every document anyone could possibly ask for. Sitting behind the desk was the HOA president, Richard Holloway, late 50s, perfect haircut, expensive watch, the kind of smile that somehow managed to feel like an insult. He also owned a local construction company that had become pretty successful over the years. I introduced myself, sat down, and calmly slid the folder across his desk. I think there must have been a misunderstanding, I said. Ranger is a federally certified service dog. Everything you need is in there. Richard didn't even open the folder. He placed 2 fingers on it and slowly pushed it right back toward me like it was something dirty. I don't need to read any of that, he said without the slightest hint of hesitation. I blinked. I'm sorry. He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. The board decided we don't allow large dogs. Doesn't matter what paperwork you've got. I tried to stay respectful. Years in the military teach you that losing your temper rarely improves a situation. Actually, I replied, under federal law, service animals aren't considered pets. HOA policies don't override the A-Day. He laughed, not a loud laugh, just enough to let me know he thought I was wasting his time. Federal law doesn't run Maple Ridge, he said. I do. I remember staring at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. You're telling me you're ignoring disability protections? I asked. He shrugged. I'm telling you that if you like living here, you'll get rid of the dog. If not, 7 days goes by pretty fast. There was a long silence between us. Ranger was sitting quietly beside my chair, perfectly trained, perfectly calm, causing absolutely no disturbance whatsoever. Richard looked down at him and smirked. "Cute dog," he said. "Find him another home." Something shifted inside me at that exact moment. Not rage, disappointment, the kind that settles in your chest when you realize someone has mistaken kindness for weakness. I picked up the folder, thanked him for his time, clipped Ranger's leash back on, and walked out without another word. Richard probably thought he'd won. He had no idea he'd just made the biggest professional mistake of his entire life. Because there was one thing about me that never came up during our conversation. One thing I never advertised to neighbors or strangers. After leaving active duty, I didn't retire into a quiet desk job. I became a senior compliance investigator for a federal agency responsible for auditing contractors working on programs serving disabled veterans, investigating fraud, civil rights violations, and contract compliance wasn't just my career. It was literally my job. And that night, sitting in my home office while Ranger slept beside my desk, I opened my government laptop and typed one name into a federal contractor database. Richard Holloway? The name appeared almost instantly. Richard Holloway, active contractor. Multiple federally funded renovation projects focused on improving accessibility for disabled veterans. Total contract value, just over $250,000. I leaned back in my chair and honestly closed my eyes for a second because I couldn't believe what I was looking at. Out of every contractor in Central Ohio, the guy who had just looked me in the eye and said federal law didn't apply to him happened to make his living from federal contracts designed to help people exactly like me. Ranger lifted his head and rested it against my knee like he always did whenever I got quiet. I scratched behind his ears and laughed under my breath. "Buddy," I whispered, "I don't think this is going to end the way he thinks it is." Here's the thing people misunderstand about investigators. We don't go looking for ways to ruin people. Quite the opposite. Every complaint creates paperwork, interviews, audits, legal reviews, weeks or months of work. The easiest case is the one that never has to be opened. I sat there for almost 20 minutes asking myself whether I should just let it go. Maybe send one more email. Maybe ask for another meeting. Maybe the board would overrule Richard if they actually saw my paperwork. I wanted every excuse not to escalate it because once federal investigators get involved, nobody really wins. Then I remembered the way he pushed my ADA documentation back across a desk without even opening it. I remembered him saying, "Federal law doesn't run Maple Ridge." I do. That wasn't ignorance anymore. That was intent. I picked up my phone and called my immediate supervisor. "Hey, Tom," I said after he answered. "I've got something unusual." He chuckled. "When you start a sentence like that, my afternoon gets longer." I walked him through everything from the HOA letter to the meeting with Richard. There was silence for several seconds after I finished. Finally, he asked, "You still got the paperwork? Every document? Witnesses?" My neighbor saw the letter. Security cameras at the HOA office probably recorded the meeting. And he made the statements directly to my face. Tom sighed. "Well, you already know what comes next." "Yeah," I answered quietly. "I do." By the following morning, I had submitted a formal complaint documenting disability discrimination by an active federal contractor. I attached copies of the HOA notice, Ranger certification, my medical documentation, my notes from the meeting, and the names of potential witnesses. Once the complaint entered the system, it no longer belonged to me. It became part of a federal review process that operated completely independently from my personal feelings. That's another thing people get wrong. I couldn't simply cancel it if I changed my mind. Compliance investigations exist because taxpayer money comes with conditions. If you're accepting federal dollars to serve disabled veterans, you don't get to decide which disabled veterans deserve respect. 2 days later, I was drinking coffee on my back patio when Mrs. Jenkins walked over carrying a plate of homemade banana bread. She had that worried look older neighbors get when they've been watching neighborhood gossip unfold from behind lace curtains. "Honey," she said, "Richard's been driving around asking people questions about you." I raised an eyebrow. "Like what? Whether you've been causing problems? Whether anyone's afraid of your dog?" That sort of thing. I smiled. And what did everybody tell him? She laughed so hard she nearly dropped the plate. They asked if he'd lost his mind. Ranger's probably the best behaved dog on the street. That was comforting. But it also told me Richard was already trying to build a story after the fact. Unfortunately for him, facts have a stubborn habit of surviving bad narratives. Early Friday morning, just 72 hours after I'd submitted the complaint, my work phone buzzed while I was making breakfast. It was Tom again. "You watching the news?" he asked. "No, you don't need to. Our Inspector General's office just authorized an immediate compliance review." I looked down at Ranger, who was patiently waiting for a piece of bacon that he absolutely knew he wasn't getting. "That was fast." "Not really," Tom replied. "Civil rights allegations involving current contractors get priority, especially when the evidence starts with written documentation." Around lunchtime, curiosity got the better of me. I drove past one of Richard's renovation sites on the opposite side of town. I stayed on the public road because I had absolutely no business being involved anymore. The process belonged to another division now. Even from the street, though, I could see 3 government vehicles parked outside the property. Men and women wearing federal identification badges were walking in and out, carrying boxes of files. One inspector was photographing equipment. Another was interviewing employees individually near the entrance. Richard stood in the middle of it all, talking with animated hands, pointing at papers, occasionally glancing toward the vehicles like someone desperately hoping the entire situation would somehow disappear. It didn't. I drove away without stopping. That evening, my phone started exploding with calls and text messages from neighbors. Apparently, word had spread that something major was happening to Richard's construction company. Nobody knew why. Rumors spread through subdivisions faster than electricity. Some people claimed tax fraud. Others guessed unpaid employees. One person insisted the FBI had arrested somebody. None of it was true. I ignored every message because discussing an active federal investigation would have been wildly inappropriate. Monday morning, I found another envelope in my mailbox. This one hand-delivered instead of certified. It was from the HOA attorney asking if I would consider attending a special executive session with the board. That was interesting because Richard hadn't wanted to read my paperwork 4 days earlier. Now suddenly lawyers wanted meetings. I agreed. Walking into the clubhouse that evening felt completely different from the first visit. Richard wasn't sitting at the head of the table anymore. Instead, every board member looked exhausted. Their attorney stood beside a stack of folders while several residents waited outside the room, hoping to hear what was happening. One of the board members, an older gentleman named Frank, cleared his throat before speaking. "Mr. Carter, we'd like to apologize." I didn't answer immediately. I simply waited. Frank continued. "We were not fully informed about your documentation." I looked across the table until my eyes landed on Richard. For the first time since we'd met, he couldn't hold eye contact. "Really?" I asked calmly, because I personally handed him every document. The room went quiet. Richard finally spoke. "There may have been some confusion." I couldn't help smiling. "Confusion?" I repeated. "You told me federal law didn't run this neighborhood." Nobody said a word. The silence became almost uncomfortable. Finally, the attorney slid several documents across the table. "The board intends to rescind the violation immediately, refund all fines, reimburse legal expenses you've incurred, and negotiate an additional settlement if we can avoid prolonged litigation." Richard suddenly interrupted. "This is ridiculous. We're acting like he's the victim." Every head in the room turned toward him. Frank slammed his hand against the table so hard everyone jumped. "Enough, Richard." His voice echoed across the clubhouse. "You've already done enough damage." That was the first moment I realized Richard hadn't told the board the entire story. They hadn't known about the federal complaint. They hadn't known investigators were reviewing his contracts. More importantly, they hadn't known he was the reason the HOA was suddenly staring at potential discrimination claims that could cost every homeowner money. Then the attorney quietly dropped one final sentence that changed the atmosphere completely. "Mr. Holloway," he said, "your company has officially been notified that its federal accessibility contract has been suspended pending termination." Richard's face turned white. He looked like someone had punched every ounce of confidence out of him in a single sentence. For a man who always seemed to have an answer for everything, he suddenly couldn't find a single word. The board members looked at one another in stunned silence as the reality finally settled over the room. This had never been about a dog. It had become something much, much bigger. Richard looked around the room as if someone would jump in to save him, but nobody did. The confidence he'd worn like an expensive suit just a few days earlier was gone. His attorney wouldn't look at him. The board members suddenly found the conference table fascinating. Even the residents waiting outside the clubhouse had stopped whispering because they could tell something serious was happening behind those closed doors. I sat there quietly. Not because I was enjoying the moment, but because there really wasn't anything left for me to say. I hadn't started this process. I'd simply refused to let someone ignore the law because they thought nobody would push back. The attorney broke the silence first. "Mr. Carter," he said carefully, "we've prepared a settlement proposal that includes reimbursement of the improper fine, compensation for your legal consultation, and additional damages related to the discrimination complaint." He slid the paperwork toward me. I glanced at the numbers without reacting. Money had never been the point. Ranger was lying peacefully beside my chair, completely unaware that he'd somehow become the center of the biggest controversy this neighborhood had ever seen. I reached down and scratched behind his ears. "He's been the calmest one in this room all week," I joked. A couple of board members actually laughed, mostly out of relief that someone had finally broken the tension. Richard didn't. He was staring at me with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Finally, he spoke, his voice much quieter than before. "You knew who you were the whole time." I looked back at him. "Of course I did. You could have warned me." I couldn't help shaking my head. "Richard, I tried. I handed you every document you needed. I explained the law. You pushed it back across your desk because you decided you already knew everything." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There really wasn't an argument left to make. A week earlier, he believed authority came from being the loudest person in the room. Now he was learning that real authority comes with responsibility, and responsibility has consequences. Before the meeting ended, the board voted unanimously to remove Richard as HOA president effective immediately. No dramatic speeches, no long debate, just one vote after another until every hand had gone up. Watching it happen was almost surreal. The same people who had quietly followed him for years were now distancing themselves as quickly as possible. Later that afternoon, I received confirmation through official channels that Richard's federal contract had been formally terminated. The review had uncovered not only the discrimination complaint but additional compliance concerns that investigators were now examining separately. Whether those issues would have surfaced eventually without my complaint, I honestly don't know. What I do know is that federal contractors agree to certain standards when they sign those contracts, and treating disabled veterans with dignity isn't optional. It's part of the job. Over the next several days, the HOA finalized everything. The violation disappeared from my record. Every dollar they had attempted to collect was returned. They covered my legal expenses and reached a financial settlement that every party agreed would remain confidential. Although I can say it was enough to remind the association that shortcuts are usually far more expensive than simply following the law in the first place. Life slowly returned to normal after that. Kids started riding their bikes again. Mrs. Jenkins went back to worrying about her roses instead of neighborhood drama. People still waved when I walked Ranger around the block, although now those waves lingered a little longer. Some neighbors quietly thanked me. Others admitted they'd been afraid to challenge the HOA for years because they assumed nobody ever won. I always gave them the same answer. This wasn't about winning. It never was. It was about reminding people that rules have to apply equally, especially to the people enforcing them. A few weeks later, I hung 3 things on the wall in my home office. The first was the original HOA violation letter giving me 7 days to remove Ranger. The second was Ranger's service dog certification that Richard had refused to read. The third wasn't a government document or a legal ruling. It was a simple photograph of Ranger sleeping peacefully on the living room floor the night everything was finally over. Every once in a while, I'll catch myself looking at those three frames together, and they remind me how close I came to believing it would have been easier just to stay quiet. It would have been easier, but it also would have told the next veteran, the next disabled homeowner, the next person without a voice. That intimidation works if the bully wears a nice suit. Thankfully, it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to calmly stand their ground and let the truth do the heavy lifting. Richard wanted me out of my own home within 7 days. Instead, less than a week later, he was the one packing up his office while my best friend curled up at my feet exactly where he belonged. And that's the part people still argue about whenever I tell this story. Some say I went too far. Others insist he deserved every consequence that followed. Personally, I don't think I punished him at all. I think he simply collided with the rules he'd spent years believing only applied to everyone else. But I'm curious what you think. If you had been sitting in that chair, would you have filed the complaint? Or would you have let it go and walked away? Let me know down in the comments because I genuinely want to hear where you draw the line between standing up for yourself and taking things too far. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, an abuse of authority, or someone who underestimated you until the truth caught up with them, share your story below. I read every comment, and chances are your experience might end up helping someone else realize they don't have to stay silent.